Before we get into it, I need to introduce our long-term friend and former crew member of CG Cookie, Tim. It's great to see you, sir.
Hello, hello. Yeah, it's great to be here.
This is like getting the band back together.
I know, I'm glad to be back.
Tim was with CG Cookie teaching 2D illustration for, what was it, 6 or 7 years?
I think 7. Yeah.
7 years, man. So he was there when I joined, and I mean, always enjoyed working with you. We struck up a friendship, and one thing we talked a lot about was movies when we would get together for company retreats and things like that. So Tim has left and been on his own, kind of living the dream for many of us as a standalone artist. That's not what you call it, as a solo artist, like completely self-reliant, doing your own work, no one telling you what you have to create. One thing I love about you, Tim, is I think you've got an excellent grasp of like art in general, like human expression, and especially when it comes to film. I value your perspective. You bring a lot of insight, and I mean, would you call yourself a cinephile? Because I would have called you one.
Yeah. I mean, my one of my things is I try to watch a new movie every day. I don't know. I just love film. Like if I wasn't an artist, I genuinely believe I would be a film like reviewer, critiquer of some level.
With that in mind, let's get into Charge, the latest, greatest open movie from the Blender Animation Studio, written and directed by Hjalti Hjalmarsson. I practiced that. I think I was close. But this is his 3.5th time directing. He directed Coffee Run, Daily Dweebs, Agent, and co-directed Agent 327. So that's where the point 0.5 came from. And then as far as the team that made Charge, I counted 33 humans as part of the credits, not counting the special thanks. Hope that's not mean, but 7 3D artists specifically. And I have here that it was the first open movie rendered with Eevee, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I know Eevee was a big push for the project, but maybe Coffee Run was rendered with Eevee. I'm not sure, Lampel or Wayne, if you know about that.
I can't imagine them using cycles in Coffee Run. That doesn't make any sense.
That's kind of where I'm at too. And I think Eevee was out at that point, but it wasn't like featured with render passes like it does now.
Maybe they didn't have motion blur. So if they didn't have motion blur, maybe they used cycles for that one. But that was 78,000 years ago. So you're like, what? I can't remember anything from back then.
Tan brought the mantra that apparently has been brought for a few of the open movies, which is no story, maximum impact. It was inspired by game cinematics and real-time demos, which I think makes sense. It's, focusing on EV. We've got Unreal Engine that's pushing the bar like never before. So it makes sense to kind of focus on like realism within a more real-time production environment. It was intended to be 2 minutes, is what the announcement post listed, and ended up being just over 3. Some notable tech goals, because being a Blender open movie, they're always trying to push the software by using a production environment, and unprecedented character realism was one of their goals. I think I could say for the studio especially. So, does anyone want to go first or give a hot take, Tim, since you're good at those? In terms of the let's say the narrative.
It's funny when you said that before about what the intention going into it, because I totally felt that. But the two meanings I got from it was either refusal to let go and like the old man not allowing like the natural order of things to happen. And then the second was embracing AI, which was an interesting take.
It reminded me of something that you would see on the Netflix series Love, Death and Robots. When you watch it, you look at the characters and you're like, this isn't photo realistic. This is like a video game realistic, where you look at that and you go, oh man, those graphics, look, that's awesome. Like that type of thing. But it's still a video game.
I think they kind of nailed the goal in terms of keeping the story minimal and really trying to push out beautiful visuals, that kind of high octane, high energy, the very fast pace and like cuts were, I think, conducive to what they were trying to do. The first time I watched it, I did kind of think like, bummer, I wish there was a little more to take away from the story. But given that that wasn't the goal, I actually think Yalsti did a decent job telling us, a story that leaves you with a little nugget. The first viewing, I didn't really I thought he was kind of stealing this power cell for just a robot, like a friend. He didn't have any human friends, but he's had this relationship with a robot. And it's like, okay, I mean, that's a lot of work for a robot. But then it took like the second viewing to realize there's this brain in the head. And I wonder if in this dystopian future, it's used to be a full human. And then over time, like we see a mechanical augmentation, robotic arm on the main character. And maybe his partner like was completely augmented except for maybe the brain. So, that kind of changed my initial, shallow takeaway. And there's something there. There's love. Maybe love is what lasts, right? Like it outlasts our bodies and time, and incentive to follow the law and not break and enter, and steal stuff. But anyway,
I'm like, he's going to all this effort and he's just stealing one. So what is he going to have to do that again? Like we all charge our phones overnight. You know what I mean? Because we get worried. And it's like a typical husband where he's waiting to the last minute, 1% to have to do that. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, why isn't the robot wife going, haven't you got me my robot juice yet? I've got a question. Like, there's only one other human, excluding the robot android lady love interest. There's only the security guard. How did people feel about the purpose of him in there? It was kind of weird to see it because I noticed it. I'm like, oh, he was in it, and then he was pushed aside story wise. And then I watched it again, and it's like the only reason was to get the badge. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you guys feel about having that only other human in the story? Did anyone notice that, or was that just me?
I only noticed it because of the skin texture, and I was like, nothing else in this movie has that skin texture.
That's where I got from that skin texture. I was like, oh, that skin texture is very game demo, like game cinematic.
I think you guys are right. I don't think they were trying to say anything deep, and they were like, "Oh yeah, let's have a guy in a post-apocalyptic world." I mean, even with like the one severed robot arm, I play this game Sekiro and Elden Ring, and there were so many characters like Mad Max Furiosa or these mangas that I read, Berserk. All of them have a mechanical arm, and they're almost always on the left side. I feel like that's got to be a trope or like a list now of like characters that have one arm missing, specifically always their non-dominant hand, and I don't know why.
I think you're right. Like this is a trope at this point. And like exploding barrels in video games, I do think that the team was fully aware of this and went with it almost like tongue in cheek. Like you said, it's a tech demo, so like let's run with those things because maybe deep down everyone it kind of thinks they're fun. I'll shoot an exploding barrel, tomorrow if I get a new game just because it's there. Wayne, you said something interesting about being a short film, like you need to suspend that belief because as soon as you start to watch it a second, third time and pick it apart, it falls apart. Is it implied that like short media like this, short films, maybe can't have that nugget that doesn't fall apart the more you watch it?
Well, you could even break it down to like, Up from Pixar. Like that first 3 minutes, I don't think will ever fall apart because it's very effective in its storytelling. But what's funny is a lot of shorts, including this one, they choose not to have voice audio. And I think it works very well. And it usually helps for like the repeatable watches. But I think this one, it just doesn't have a lot to it. So I don't know if anyone would want to rewatch. Well, I don't know. That's just my opinion on it.
This is going to sound a lot worse than it is. But the next day, I forgot that I watched it. And that's not anything against the movie. That is, I think, where we've been pushed in our attention spans. Everything is so quick and fast, and attention here, attention there. So we're trained. Our brains are trained these days to forget things. That's why I mentioned the Love, Death, and Robots thing before, which if you haven't seen, it's a couple seasons, but they're all little short stories. Some of them are very violent. Some of them are sexually gratuitous. But it's like I forgot that I've watched a lot of them. And there's only a few that stand out. And then sometimes you might watch one again. I've seen this. I forgot that I watched it. And I think Charge falls into that category, not because it's bad, because I think it's pretty good and it's pretty decent. It does the job, but it doesn't hit past that ceiling that today's society has put on us.
Actually, I love that you bring up Love, Death, Robots because I was thinking when you were saying that, I was like, oh, it would fit actually really well in it. I mean, I personally am not a fan of most of them. And I think because what you're saying, like, they're just hitting the mark. Like, they're just going through the motions. But then season 3, there was one called Jabaro. And, like, that one stands out to me so much. And it's because it's so different and odd and unique and it's like elevated. People don't want to have to question what they're watching, it seems, anymore. They want to feel that it's familiar. Like they already kind of know the beats, they already kind of know the arc. So when they're watching it, it's more comforting. It's a really weird thing to say, but I think especially with film and definitely with art, it seems like people don't want to be challenged anymore. So it's like, just give me what I already know. Like I already know where it's going to go. I already kind of see what's happening, but it's comforting on some level. And I think that's what's happened with this short too.
Do you think it was specifically because it was more weird and out there and like experimental than the others? And so are we just trying to get to like maximum weirdness in a way to like get people's attention or
I had that feeling of like, oh, they're just trying to be weird for the sake of being weirdness. But then it changed my mind through the course of watching it. And I was like, wow, that was really good. And I remembered it I still remember it now. I forget the name of it, like Jabaro or like, no, it starts with J. I'll look it up, but I know like that was a good one.
I don't think it succeeds just for being weird. I actually think it has such an emotional impact where the other ones are very much like, guy shoots robot or guy. It's just very like by the books. And then this one is like this siren basically like a mermaid that draws people in, but it's a very weird take on mermaids and sirens. And by the end, you feel for the siren so much. I I've like I said, I watch a lot of movies and a lot of short film. Last year, I would actually say Jabbar was the best thing I watched. And like, what's funny is I can't stand the rest of the season.
This conversation has made me wonder, like, do you think this open movie, the Blender Animation Studio, cares about the audience outside of Blender users?
Well, I know they're not trying to become to get the big players of Hollywood, right? They're trying to get the small people. Like Tom said, he wants to take care of them, and I think that's a really great strategy. So I don't think they're caring about all of them, but I think they are producing these really high quality tech demos to say, like, we're a small studio and this is what we create. So other small studios or even bigger medium ones can look at that and go, we can use that software and we can make it work for our project. I think when they started back in 2008, Elephant's Dream, it was weirdness. Do you know what I mean? Like no one understands that movie. Like it's what is it? 9 minutes of the main character going emo, emo.
Was it 9 minutes long?
But they're getting less weird for the sake of weirdness, as we've spoken about that before, and they're getting more into the social consciousness. So this one was a tech demo in the Love, Death, Robots style, is what I feel, and that's a smart move, I think.
I think they're hitting their audience pretty well. What if someone knew of them for making a great short and not for Blender?
They've always said, and I think it's great, they're about being open and sharing their progress and helping other studios who want to follow in their footsteps. And they don't necessarily have to be open studios, but it's about the workflow. So they're doing it to find the pain points and stuff like that. So that's half of the journey. It's like, we're going to do a production to save you guys having to find the problems, and we're going to make the software better for everybody. So they're balancing many things.
The mantra, I think, bothers me a little bit. No story, maximum impact.
I'm in my mid 20s. I think I was more aggressive. Like everything needs to be unique and it has to be an expression of self. And it was definitely more of like a deep artistic expression. But for some people, that's not their intention going into it. And I can't judge someone for having like a different intention because who am I to judge what is quality, what's not? I would say if you have no story, you'll have max like commercial output. Like this is very marketable. Like you can show this to almost anyone. And like everyone will accept it because it's just basically borrowing from themes we've already seen before. So I always think like the simpler it is, like the wider audience it will have. And I think maybe that's what he's going for. And it's not a bad thing necessarily, but is it something that like what Wayne said too, like this is super forgettable. This is something that is going to be hot and then literally sizzle and it won't go anywhere, in like a month or two. No one's gonna be talking about Charge, in my opinion.
I mean, certainly not for narrative reasons, I wouldn't imagine.
It's strange that I'm talking so negatively about it. I actually thought it was fine. I thought it was decent. But like on a technical level, because I only did 3D for like 3 years in college, it seemed like it was fine. But especially when I see other games and stuff that come out that I think are really pushing the limit. I mean, even something like Ratchet and Clank, it's like stunningly gorgeous, and that's not even realism. And then you watch Final Fantasy Remake, and like those graphics are like stunning. Blender no longer has that stigma it had 10 years ago of being like, oh, the 3D software, like, look how impressive it is. I mean, everyone's like, oh yeah, Blender, that's great software to use for whatever you're trying to make. So it's interesting seeing as a tech demo, But I thought it did its job. And one thing I thought it did really well, it was consistent. I felt like the graphic quality of it was consistent, like from the skin textures, the clothes textures, the robotic. The only thing that I wrote down that seemed off for me watching it was the candles, and specifically like the top 10% of it didn't really have a lot of subsurface scattering in it. So they felt like very plasticky. Like even with you, Kent, like I know you've talked about this with like skin and like wanting to see texture that can have that glow within the texture. Like push it then if it has, because if you freeze frame the candles, they're very like plastic bought Hobby Lobby candles, in my opinion.
I'm looking at that shot right now, and I would bet you that those are emission meshes. They're not emitting geometry, and in EV that does not influence subsurface scattering. So I think it's a very good observation. I didn't really notice it.
Well, it threw me off guard because I was like, why does he have like 20 candles on? It just, I mean, that's just me nitpicking, but it definitely was weird. I'm like, all right, so this guy lit 20 candles in this post apocalyptic workshop. Like, you might want to save those candles, maybe one at a time, my dude.
I mean, that would take like 10 minutes to do, I feel like.
Right? And he left him on when he was gone. I think that bothered me the most because I'm like, the robot doesn't need it. Like, why are you wasting the wax?
One thing I did want to talk about, I think this is kind of in between the narrative and leading into technical execution, is the goal was a game kind of tech demo, game cinematic. I personally think that they nailed that. I think we've all kind of said that.
It definitely looked like a game.
I think as a game cinematic, I thought it worked very well because to me, I felt like it was imploring that there was so much more to discover, even outside of this short little narrative. But they did it in what, 3 minutes? They gave you the whole idea of the world using this story.
Lampel, so you mentioned that it looked like a game. So when I say game cinematic, I think of like rendered offline stuff, like your Blur Studio stuff, your Blizzard, not in-game cinematics. But did you think it more fit the in-game cinematic?
I think it was right in between. There are moments where it looked like it was in game, and then moments where it clearly looked like it wasn't. And so I think it just depends on which pieces we're talking about.
My general feeling on the technical execution was that it was pretty high. I think the way I would describe how I felt is when I think back to the first 10 years of open movies, Elephant's Dream, Big Buck Bunny, Sintel, Tears of Steel, and even Cosmos Laundromat a little bit, I could sense the struggle that the team had with the software. They were always trying to push a new feature, new render engine that was young. After that, I feel like maybe Blender had gotten to a place like Tim, you were talking about, kind of out of that stigma of being your free software that's maybe underdeveloped or underperformant. Narrative maybe wasn't making big leaps, but the technical ability to produce an animated short film, I think just got better and better and better. And it's not so much a question of can Blender do these things? The spray can explosion is phenomenal in this short. Like that's one thing, if I was part of the production, I would have left for the end. I'll figure out something when I get there, but like I would have phoned it in the best I could. But I thought that looked unbelievable. And I thought that the destruction of when they're fighting and like actually making the parts that they're hitting deform, I thought that was evidence that you're not struggling with incapable software. Like you're putting all these little details because you can.
I would totally agree that there's no struggle with the software anymore. And I think another thing that they have done at the studio, which was really quite brilliant, is to hire some really clever tech people and then put the tools in their hands and go, okay, we've invented this geometry nodes. And Simon Toms, he's like, okay, let me figure this out. Boom, here's something genius. And I think that's great. You need to have a few tech-minded geniuses on your team, and that will help. Like an animator doesn't need to figure that out. It's like, okay, here's a tech problem. We need an exploding can, right? Give it to a genius, a tech genius, and go figure this out. And they go, right, geometry nodes can do that. And then they'll just figure it out. And if it doesn't work, they know exactly what to say to the person who's going to be able to fix it. So that was really smart. And that's why I think the technical level of the software, like the limitations, is not showing as much in these ones, is because they're hiring excellent people to work on the problems.
Times with the spray can, also when he sprayed the security cameras, that like extra texture that's like moving across the glass. I was like, oh, that looks so good. And there were several moments like that where I was like, wow, this looks amazing. I think the one technical limitation that I did spot that was pretty consistent throughout the whole thing was cloth simulation, which is, I know, something that like can really slow down a production, but it did look like a game in the sense that all of his clothes are like stuck to him, and as he moves around, all of his clothes are exactly, stuck to his body. And so that kind of sets it apart from like a offline render for me, where you have all that time that you can spend on that kind of stuff.
I did not even make note that there were no cloth sim.
The movement of his clothes themselves, like, looks really good. I just happened to notice that, oh, the character is designed in such a way that they don't have to do that.
I have a point, I've kind of touched on it about going the extra mile because when he swings the wrench at the robot and then the arm dents, if that were me and I had like budget concerns, I needed to cut something, I would have just thrown some sparks in and said no one's going to notice that the metal doesn't actually dent. But they did put that in there. If I remember, it was enough that I would assume I would tell you everything that had collision dented. It was thorough enough that that's what I would say without actually going through every shot frame by frame. But then you bring up the cloth and it's like, I don't think it would have been crazy. So when the security guard that we talked about, when he turns around, there was something that felt phoned in, maybe. That was the one part that felt like clearly this did not get the same attention as the main character. I understand the need to do that, but a little bit of either cloth sim or just a blend shape that makes a normal map kind of turn on for wrinkles, right? Right? Like something would have gone a really long way than to just leave it a skinned mesh. So on one hand, I praise like the details that they put in there. On the other hand, it's like, wow, they could have used a little cloth sim maybe.
Looking at the rig for the face too, they had all those things in there when it came to the wrinkles and all of that. And when the camera was close up on the face, I was like, wow, this looks really, really good. But then when it zoomed out to see his whole body, like, well, that's a character.
They went really above and beyond. I would say the best, most thorough facial rig with automatic, smart wrinkling kind of stuff that I've ever seen from Blender.
Yeah, they pulled off some great stuff with the character, but a lot of it, animation wise, it feels like a young person acting out these movements. And as someone who is an old man, I can't move like that. And I just noticed that. And especially the weight of his chest is a young person in an old man body. It's like, Kelty, wait till you get old and then try and move like that. And you'll be like, I know what Wayne's talking about now. You try and move and it's freaking hard. You can look at shows like Arcane where you have the big characters and the old characters and they pull it off. So they move in a way that's realistic to their age. But then when they're fighting, they're doing these agile things, but it's not young person agility. It's that character doing some amazing things, big fist pumps and punches, and it still looks right and matches.
There is a part where he's getting shot at by the robot and things are exploding. It's right before he jumps through the smoke, that hero shot that I think you were talking about. And he winces in a moment and as like a bullet flies by and then kind of has this determination transition. And that happens all very quickly, but I feel like that's very high quality animation, in my opinion. I really love that shot. Was there similar criticism with Spring too? Because it was applied to
Like a 30-year-old something applied to a 13-year-old girl, and the movement there was the same thing. It didn't match the character.
how would you, if you're animating that? Because I don't know how I would introduce, if I'm 30, how I introduce like 55, 60-year-old aesthetic to it.
You could get someone older,
Oh, to do your reference. Sure.
or you can also take your reference and know what to push. Or even, okay, I'm an older man. Don't just do your reference in your jeans and your t-shirt or whatever it is. Put a vest on with, 5 kilograms, a backpack on or something like that. That's going to affect the way that you move. And then you'll get a different performance. Here's another point about you liked the wincing. Oh, you thought that was really great. But would a character who is a seasoned survivor, would they wince when there's like a bullet flying past their head? Or would they go, oh, this is just all in a day's work?
Oh no, I bought the wins. I bought the wins.
It's an interesting point, but in a sense of animation, I think it would be less believable because maybe he just wouldn't be doing anything. He would just keep the pose. Whereas like giving something extra in that moment. But I do tend to think a bullet's gonna make even a soldier wince. With the face, there was one thing about the face, and they clearly put a lot of work into it. There was, posted several things on, a blog post about it, and Twitter tweets. And I felt like all that work was not at maximum showcase in the short film. I thought that the tech demo renders kind of without that, all that great work would have, been lost. And then I realized that they were rendering with cycles in the tech demos. I don't know if anyone noticed that.
It was such a big difference. Like when I saw the cycles renders, I was blown away.
The face shot, a couple of the face shots were the most impressive things in there. Just before he's about to get smacked, his facial reactions in that, top notch. But I think they could have maybe shown the face off more in more spots. You know what I mean? Like they put in all that work and it's only like these tiny little bits.
I wonder if they put all this hair on because it would covered up some skin, and I don't think Eevee is great with subsurface scattering.
I don't think they're trying to hide skin because skin is hard. I think they're trying to show hair because hair is hard, and we've built this new system to test out.
I do think on the security guard who had no facial hair, it looked a lot worse. So I think that whether it was intentional or not, the beard on the main character helped him look a lot more pleasing. I mentioned the reflections and how I felt like they were very low for being, especially in like a sci-fi kind of factory. I was surprised that it felt a little bit flatter. Did that resonate with you at all?
I thought a lot of it looked really flat, specifically in his house and in some of the like rusted areas. I didn't specifically see that in the factory, so I'm going back and looking at that now. Because I thought the robot like had a pretty good shine to him, but as far as like actual reflections go, then it makes sense that there weren't any of those because Eevee can't really do that.
I kept scratching my head about it again because I think reflections make everything so much more interesting generally. And the fact that it ended up flat because they had the right stuff, like the wrench or the tools were like scraped on the edges and it looked like chrome, but it didn't shine and shimmer like metal. So there were reflections. I'm not suggesting that there were absolutely none, but it seemed almost intentional to dial them way down. And then I started to wonder, is it because everything is being lit with just lamps? I don't know if HDRIs were being used that much because that to me is the best way to get like holistic reflections. You know, as long as it's close enough to the scene, it will work. But the more I looked at it, and specifically the robot, whenever some of the specular reflections hit, and on the face too, it just felt like maybe they're only rendering with lamp objects in lieu of HDRIs. But
That would be my guess because the problem with HDRIs is that while you have better reflections now, you also don't have good shadows because it boosts everything in Eevee because it's coming from the world and HDRIs can't cast shadows. So if you have those, the downside is you can't have the accurate lighting. So it's kind of a trade-off.
I would say that the spray paint can, again, was phenomenal. I thought it was incredible. Did anyone notice the Easter egg on the texture of the spray paint can?
Don't tell me, is there a Suzanne on it? Because I was expecting him to go, did anyone notice at frame 37 there was a Suzanne in the background? Did you guys not see that? I noticed it straight away.
Not Suzanne, and I think that's a classy move. I'm a little tired of the Suzanne, if I'm completely that probably I'm out of the Blender club
Yeah.
now.
Can't get out.
It is kind of a cool thing. So it is a pink color, and what does pink represent in Blender?
Missing texture.
Missing texture. So in the label of the spray paint, it says, check carefully for missing textures on your body, and then it splats on the robot. I thought that was a nice Easter egg.
Are you the only one that's found that? And is everyone like, my mind is blown?
So I realized today that I had not watched it in 4K. I read in the blog post that they rendered it 4K, and I wanted to see like, is the face? Do we see more of the face fidelity from that? And then when I got to the 4K of the spray paint, I just kind of went frame by frame and figured that's a lot of writing, so there's got to be something in there. And sure enough.
Nice.
Okay, I also think I need to say that I feel like when I go into a Blender Open Movies, there's a lot of different parts of me. One that's excited to see Blender being presented this way, being pushed in this format. So I'm rooting for it. I'm also coming from a place of maybe what I think the broader 3D world looks at it like, okay, let's see what this halfway, software that's free and open source can do. So I've got like I'm expecting it to not be good. And once it accomplishes satisfaction for me and it checks off some of the boxes, I think I just have rose-colored glasses for the rest of it. And this one was definitely that way. And I wonder, the robot specifically, I thought it was clever how it adapted to when its arm fell off or it got pulled off. And in the tech demos, the blog post, or the making of maybe, they talk about the ideas of making the robot behave a little more uniquely. And I thought they pulled that off, but I also am not a robot expert. But what did you guys think about, it wasn't just a robot that was humanoid, like it had some interesting mechanics involved.
I thought the robot was pretty cool. I did love it. The arm goes like that's great. As a rigging standpoint, you're like, how do you decide whether that is a left arm, like a dot L or a dot R? Like how do you name that? Is the first thing that I was thinking. But then I did have one of those moments of like, forget it, Wayne. Just go with the story of like, why wasn't that robot the security guard? Because there's no way known anyone's getting in there.
It is interesting. Ever since you mentioned it, it's like, why make that a human? Why go through the effort of risking the uncanny valley in that moment? But it seems just to get the security badge, which like, is that what they're using in this future? I don't know.
Well, because normally you push the button to open the door.
You got to protect the power cells, I guess. It did bother me that he didn't come out with 10 in his arms. And in one of the last shots, as he's approaching his house, he's like coddling this one tiny power cell.
I did think the designs of the robots looked great, and even the robot back at his house, like, I thought they looked really good.
Here's another robot question. When the battery is gone zero, does that brain die? How long have you got between like eject and put the new one in? And if it's like a USB where you have to put it in and go, oh, not that way, and then you put it the other way, and then you're like, oh, it was the first way again, you'd be in trouble if you've only got like a couple of seconds of switch over time.
You notice some of those plot holes pretty, you got a radar for it, my friend.
One thing that could have been added to the story was he did try and get a whole bag full of stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like he went in there, he overreached. People always go for what they need and then they go for extra. And it's going for that extra where they struggle, you know. So it could have been a fight and then he loses all of them except for one. Could have solved that. Why didn't he try and stockpile? Especially if you're in a post-apocalyptic world, you're like, I don't want to do this every other day. Let's just go in there and get the job done for as long as we can.
Oh, Tim, I forgot. I don't mean to circle all the way back to story, but you mentioned AI acceptance as one of the things you took away. I wanted to ask you about that because I didn't get that at first. But yeah, can you explain a little bit about where you got that from?
I think like speaking of like the pros of the short, I thought they were really smart with their time efficiency and like timing. When he first steals the battery from the robot and they're like in the struggle, it took a second and it took a beat where there's a pause and then the alarm went off and then things started happening. I think that's where this shined the brightest for me is like the way they timed certain things. And even things that I would normally find annoying is the robot has a gun and he's shooting at the guy. And then when he jumps with the wrench, I'm so glad that he attacked the arm, the gun arm. And the second time he hits it, a little explosion goes off, just a little one. And it kind of shows that the gun is now unable to be used because it drives me nuts because the scenes after the robot's then attacking him, I'm like, why not use the gun? And then I had to like rewatch it. I was like, okay, good. They show that the gun is now like malfunctioning. But then to end on a hand, a human hand with a robot hand, there's a fireplace and it's like this unity. I think it just, I don't know if it's because I'm so tied to the art world. That is so much of like a sign or like a symbol of accepting technology, even if it wasn't supposed to be AI and it was like his wife or whatever.
It could go either way. I'm curious if Yalti sees this. Maybe he's like, no, do not. I hate AI art. Or he's like, yeah, you got it. I'm curious.
That did not even cross my mind when I was watching it. But if we do bring that in, then what do you think the difference would be between the robot that he's fighting, or like the group of robots that are in the building versus the one at home? What would those two things represent if that's part of the story?
I mean, I would love to hear this discussion.
I think maybe the only difference is that there's a brain behind the one at home. So there is a human
Organic brain, right?
organic brain. It is interesting because if he does like robots and he's getting attacked by one, he could just say, whoa, 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 hey, hey, some of my best friends are robots. Like just back away. And then the robot would be like, oh yeah, yeah, good plan. Yeah, no, I overreacted. Yeah, let's then you go, come and get a beer. And then they sit down and
I don't think it's intentional either.
No, not at all.
the difference is there's a human brain in one, it's being controlled, like it's not totally autonomous. And the other one is totally autonomous. It's a bad guy. It's not, it has no humanity.
There was also the human that got tranquilized or whatever that would probably fit in the same category as that robot in the terms of the story, but he's still human.
Yeah, but he works for the bad people. So, you know.
I do have one possibly controversial take that I want to throw your way. When I immerse myself in the short today and the blog posts and stuff, towards the end, I actually got really excited for how well I think they pulled off the technical stuff. I would make the argument that the Blender Animation Studio is like AAA quality. They're in the conversation. Keep in mind, you know, if you're talking about Blizzard versus Digic Pictures versus Blur, you know, there's different budgets, there's different amounts of artists working on this. So there's differences. But I think the best way to support what I think about their quality is like, if you asked Blur to make Charge, would it look much different than what we have? What do you guys think?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think it would look much different. Maybe they would just invest more time in certain areas, but overall, I don't think it would look much different.
Yeah, I mean, out of any of the things that at least I've critiqued so far, I feel like it's mostly been on time constraints on the artists. I would be fully confident if you gave any of these people one shot to polish, they would polish the absolute heck out of it. It would look so good. There's no doubt in my mind that that would be the case. I think it's mostly probably budget.
I completely agree, which is I think exciting because if Blender Studio continues to do better each year, I mean there's new donors and so their budgets can grow and even the number of people listed in the credits is growing short film to short film. So yeah, it's pretty neat to think that if that studio had the budget, I would argue Blender's not holding it back. And when you put the right people in the right place, the tools are going to follow suit. And I don't know, I think that's a pretty bright future for the studio. Very impressive for me personally. Well, guys, that was a very good conversation. You never disappoint. I mean, I'm thinking about the short film in new ways already. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for bringing your expertise and making this a fun discussion. Tim, thank you especially for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We'll have you back on soon so we can squash this AI. I mean, so we can talk about AI art.
It's definitely not going to get squashed.
All right, you guys have a good one.